Welcome everyone to another episode of AppSec 101. My name is Andrew Garrett and I am a product marketing manager here at Micro Focus Fortify. And I'm pleased to be joined today by Dylan Thomas, who is the Director of Product Management here at Micro Focus Fortify. So I'm very pleased to be joined by him today, and he's going to be diving into the topic of what is container security. So Dylan, before we get started, maybe you could take just a minute and share a little bit with us about your background.
Sure. I appreciate it, Andrew, and looking forward to talking about container security today. So I've been with Fortify now for about 6 years, and prior to that, I've been in product management for over 10 years. Really exciting spending the last 6 years in AppSec specifically, and working in all aspects of AppSec. Helping customers solve challenges with different scanning types and use cases, whether it's static analysis, dynamic analysis. A lot of time spent with our Fortify on Demand customers and helping them deploy application security through our cloud-based service as well. So, prior to that, I was an electrical and computer engineer, so I'm a technologist at heart, and so I just really enjoy staying up on the latest technology, both in software and application security and in general. So the topic of containers is of particular interest to me because it represents a lot of great opportunity for us to improve how we build software.
Well, that's great. Well, yeah, I'm really excited to dive into this topic today with you, Dylan, and it sounds like you have a lot of background. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. So to start things off, maybe let's just take a very high-level overview of what is container security, maybe for those people that haven't heard the term before.
Sure. Hopefully not to use the terms container security in a definition, but really it's just container security I view and is an evolution of the existing security processes we use to build software. It's an evolution of who does what. It's an evolution of the technology that we use to mitigate risk for the applications we build, run, and deploy. The main difference here is, of course, we're deploying them through containers, this new architecture that's really gained a foothold in adoption because of all the benefits it brings. So over the years, we've gone from running applications and software on physical hardware over to virtualized VMs. Now we've moved and added this containerization to our tool belt that we have in the software industry. And so that it presents a set of new challenges. And so as we think about what does container security mean, we definitely want to consider thinking about the evolution of that architecture. So in a container-based system, we have the host OS and the container runtime and multiple containers running on that same stack, essentially. And so that just opens up a lot of new considerations that have to be made, both in terms of the development process as well as how we run and how we build containerized apps. So a lot of the things we've been doing, they still apply. This concept of container security is very much additive onto what good secure development practices and how you securely run software in a modern sense today, right? So, as we look and diving in deeper, a lot of it's going to be, I think, exploring really how do we evolve what we're doing to better understand these new risks associated with containerized apps.
Well, that's great. Yeah, and like you mentioned, this containerization, there's a lot of benefits to it, and it makes programming a lot easier in some ways. But what are maybe some of the reasons why it's so important to have security when you're in these development life cycles and when you're working with containers?
Yeah, that's a great question. So it really is understanding kind of some of the main drivers of what is different when it comes to building and deploying and running applications that are containerized. So two of the main ones are understanding just the new attack vectors, and particularly from an AppSec perspective. A large part of that is if we think about what are developers now responsible for. So we have this shifting roles and responsibilities as well as this other part of it. So you have these new components, new ways you're building it, new design paradigms combined with folks in the development lifecycle who maybe are being thrust into roles and being responsible for considerations on the security side that they weren't historically. Traditionally, you might have a system administrator or a network operations engineer responsible for doing things like setting up network segmentation and network security groups and handling patching, those type of things. Well, In a containerized environment, some of those responsibilities can now be shifted left in the development lifecycle, now being driven by development as they define their software as code. So that's where so now you have a developer who's already got a lot on their plate. They're the ones adding the business logic, driving the business value by creating these apps and adding features and functionality and fixing bugs, right? Trying to build that in a secure way. Now they're also having to think through not just how the app itself is built, but how is it going to be run and deployed? And so because you're defining the container earlier in the life cycle, because you're defining the infrastructure it's running on, in the orchestration, sometimes earlier in the life cycle, there's a knowledge gap that needs to be crossed and shared across roles on the team. So that's really one of the key important factors that makes container security different, just because you're asking folks to do things they haven't had to do before. And again, we talk again with that new architecture really is that new attack vector. One thing I find interesting is that when you look at where containers originated, it was this concept of an ephemeral workload, or something that you spin up, you perform a function, you tear it down. And so a lot of the original design considerations when folks build with containers was around that concept of, well, I don't have to worry about patching because my container is only up for a few seconds to perform a very specific function and as part of this big microservices architecture. Well, as we've seen containers drive adoption, they offer many benefits, not just for those type of very modern, ephemeral, short-lived workloads, but also for traditional apps to simplify deployment. And so now you have more traditional applications that might be run on on Tomcat in a VM. Now they're being deployed, they're being containerized and deployed as well. But now that application is much more long-lived, and so that introduces a whole nother set of challenges that need to be considered when we think about container security as well.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought up the point of attack vectors, Dylan, and let's dive into that a little bit more, and let's talk about maybe what are some of the specific risks that, for those that do have solid container security in place, what are some of the risks that they could potentially avoid?
There's a lot of them, and there's no easy way to summarize all of them. But what I think I can maybe highlight a few of those that I find particularly interesting, particularly as we look at the development lifecycle side. What I mentioned earlier around splitting the lifecycle into kind of what's before production as you're building and creating the app, and then you have this aspect of after you deploy and run and operate the app. You definitely have a set of considerations that you want to implement on both sides. If we look specifically more on the development lifecycle as we're creating the app, one of the first things that you want to think about mitigating risk on would be choosing proper base images. There's a lot of important aspects that go into considering this. You need to think about not oversizing, choosing the right kind of the minimal size container that has the functionality you need. That could be something very slim like an Alpine Linux, or it could be something a little bit larger. Does the base image I'm choosing have inherent vulnerabilities in it, right? Am I choosing a vulnerable version of Ubuntu, for example? How am I choosing the latest version or something prior? Like where am I in terms of security patches? How am I going to handle that? A lot of companies will look to mitigate this and implement solutions around trusted registries to help the developer choose from a kind of a secure catalog. But that continues to introduce challenges, even if you have best practice in place, because now you've got to also consider, who's responsible for maintaining that trusted registry of base images, and then how do you help ensure that all your developers that are scattered throughout your organization know of its existence and can essentially help guide compliance with usage of that trusted registry instead of just grabbing what's the latest and greatest off of Docker Hub. So that's one I think really interesting attack vector, and really just very important base consideration is the base image of your container that a developer needs to think about. As they go about then creating the containers, this is where they're building out the Docker file that defines the various layers of the Docker image that eventually gets built. And there's a lot that can go wrong here. And so having proper container security in place allows you to ensure that you're using the best practices that are laid out by organizations like NIST, like the CIS benchmarks that are created so that you have established kind of cheat sheet or guide that developers and DevOps folks can use when they want to create these containers and ensure proper configuration. Another popular area that a container security program will in place will be around secrets management. Just the simplest place here, right, is making sure that your containers don't contain any secrets in their definitions, right? Once it's put into it, if you put a secret in a Docker file, you publish that Docker image. Now anyone has access to your encryption keys or your AWS keys, right? That's obviously a bad thing. And a proper program will help you prevent those type of easy leaks of information. Those are some of the unique attack vectors, just as an example, just as a few short examples that exist in container environment. But we also want to make sure that we don't put the cart too far before the horse, just because, and forget about all the other fundamentals that comes to building applications securely. So just because you're putting an application in container, you still need to have the established security program in place where you're doing threat modeling early on. You're doing your static analysis as you're writing the code. And as part of your CI/CD pipeline, you need to be doing your software composition analysis to identify vulnerabilities in your dependencies that are contained within the application itself. You need to be then ideally running dynamic testing to help further identify vulnerabilities best suited to be detected once an app is up and running. So that's a really great thing that most mature programs, as they begin to implement container security, they focus on building on what they already have, because you can't forget what you've done before. It's not a whole new paradigm, it's an expanded paradigm. As we look towards the running and operating side of container security, there's a whole host of considerations as well and controls that should be implemented. So again, looking back at things like the CIS benchmarks, this time for like Kubernetes deployments, to ensure that you have proper configuration and permissions and everything around your orchestration layer. Most folks are using Kubernetes. That's by far the industry leader, but there are other tools out there as well. There's the specific permissions and functions that are allowed on an individual container when it's running that govern the host container relationship. So another common risk vector would be breaking out of the container. You'll hear that a lot. And so this is ensuring that, for example, that your container is not running as root. Makes it easier to exploit a vulnerability in a container, then jump from your container to the host operating system, and then anything else that's any other container running on that host. These are kind of the logical threat exploit chains and the attack vectors that are look to be exploited when you're talking containers, right? So these are the types of risks that a robust container security program and set of controls will help you mitigate.
That's great. Well, Dylan, what I'm hearing from you is, the container security, it should be a part of your larger security portfolio. You need to be adding it on to the things you're already doing, like your static analysis, your dynamic analysis, and then the container security. When they're all integrated, it really they build on each other to create a more mature AppSec program.
Absolutely. I mean, we'd all love a silver bullet in security, but unfortunately, that doesn't yet exist. Maybe it will one day, but until then, the answer really is defense in depth and choosing and recognizing that there's no such thing as perfect security. So it's all about understanding what's the appropriate level of risk mitigation that you need, and that's going to vary from app by app. So
yeah,
the business.
Well, let's shift gears for a minute and maybe let's talk about some specific solutions that people can implement. So when they're looking for ways to ensure proper container security, are there any tools in your experience that you would recommend to users?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Absolutely. So, if we look at, kind of container security specific, there's a couple of things that we're seeing in the industry right now. There's a handful of vendors and companies out there that have developed solutions that are really kind of, soup to nuts. Everything, it's the whole life cycle. So they have, like your twist locks and your aquas. They've got everything under one house that's very much geared towards containers specifically. There's also a variety of just different kind of niche solutions out there, or point solution providers that will maybe attack one particular threat vector that you might see with containers to help supplement the existing controls you might have in place. Then of course there are the existing vendors that are already part of the software development lifecycle and securing that and securing the runtime environments and part of your operational controls, right? Again, like we talked about, those have the same place with traditional apps we would deploy via VM. They're just as applicable for containers. Virtually every vendor out there and solution out there in some way, shape, or form is providing the ability to have their solutions work with containers. So as we look at what solutions, I would say the first recommendation really is use what you have. So most companies have more than enough security tools. And so probably the first thing I would recommend is make sure you're exercising the capabilities of the solutions you already have in place. It's easy to buy tools, right? But ultimately, having the processes and the people in place to take advantage of them is usually the biggest hurdle that most companies face when it comes to deploying and maturing their security program. And those basics still apply here. Once you have that foundation of utilizing what you've already got in your portfolio, that's when you can look to then add on either kind of a more comprehensive container solution like a Twistlock or an Aqua that works with your existing portfolio and complements it, or it could be working with one of the more niche solutions out there as well if you want to fill a specific gap because you're worried about a particular attack vector. So I think that's an important part of it. One of the other things I'll also point out is that because of the involvement of developers and kind of this movement to containers and the movement of DevSecOps, there's a lot of really great open source tools out there too. So as we look, we know when we're talking AppSec, there's already kind of some established best practices around looking for known vulnerabilities and the dependencies in your application code, right? So that part of that software supply chain, we have a set of best practices around. There are a number of really strong open source tools when it comes to looking at the known vulnerabilities in the container that wraps around your application. So tools like Claire or Anchor or Trivy, these are some really good open source utilities that companies can leverage to start better understanding known vulnerabilities in the base images they're choosing to build that trusted registry for their developers, or to understand, are they introducing additional software or vulnerabilities as they build out the various layers of their Docker containers around the core application itself. So those are some of the best practices there. Other solutions, of course, are just leveraging everything, trying to stay up to date with it, but leveraging things that Docker and Kubernetes are building in. The core platforms are doing a lot to help you use them in a secure manner and have proper configuration. So taking advantage of those inherent tools in Kubernetes, or if you're using a hosted version of Kubernetes in a cloud provider like an Azure or an AWS or a GCP, there are some great tools at your disposal there to help simplify the configuration management as well.
To wrap things up here, maybe let's touch on the future of container security. And you mentioned before that there's no silver bullet, right, for security and in the development lifecycle. But what are some trends that you maybe see emerging in the future for container security?
So in terms of the future, I think a lot of the trends we've seen over the years as we have new changes in how applications are developed, the existing practices evolve to accommodate them. There's this big rush to figure out what do I do? There's this new buzzword. How do I secure that? And so what we often see are folks in the security organizations and development organizations running around. I gotta have an answer. I gotta tell my boss I have something in place. And so there's a lot of that going on right now, as everybody's just trying to collectively figure out what's a sustainable set of best practices and maturity model that we can adopt. So I think through that natural course of action, we'll see some common trends emerge, and we already are starting to see those emerge in around containerized apps and container security. I think that will continue. We'll continue to see more and more interesting, innovative solutions come out. But at a certain point, the market, I think, is going to kind of start to pull back and realize, there's a few too many solutions right on the market, and it's too much sprawl. And that's something we're already starting to hear from a lot of the enterprise customers we work with in the realm of container security. They need to make sure that they're not having too many vendors and asking developers to integrate too many tools. So I think as we see in the future, we're going to see kind of almost a bit of consolidation and kind of focus around the individual stakeholders, so we can give a smooth experience to the key folks in that software development lifecycle. So if I'm a developer, container security is just part of AppSec. So I don't I don't want to be integrating 5, 6, 7 tools. Give me one, maybe 2 tools. And that's how I can focus on mitigating risk in my app that happens to be containerized. And it's just part of what I do, because everybody at a certain point, containers will just be the norm, and it's not going to be a sexy thing anymore. It's just going to be how people build apps, right? And so at that point, container security becomes application security. And so I think that's the path we're on. We still got a ways to go, and I think we'll continue to see that consolidation amongst the user personas, not just developers, but whether it's QA, the ops folks, security folks. We can only deal with so many tools.
Yeah, I think you're spot on, and especially when you consider that consolidation is really kind of the reason that containers emerged in the first place, right? It's this whole idea of making things smoother and making things just a lot easier for developers, and so I think you're right. Well, Dylan, I appreciate you taking some time to speak with me today, and I definitely learned a lot, and hopefully our viewers will learn a lot as well. Are there any final thoughts before we wrap up?
No, I think it's just really great talking here, Andrew, and hopefully our viewers found this interesting. And if they have any questions, we'd love to engage more. There's a lot of great technology out there, and as much as anything, I think here, myself and others at Fortify, we love understanding how we can help our users solve problems and help ourselves even just kind of understand what the new trends are and be involved in that new technology and leading the forefront. So whether it's container security or otherwise, we want to be at the forefront of that.
Yeah, well, that's great. Well, thanks again to you, Dylan, and to our viewers. Thanks for watching. If you have any questions, feel free to leave a comment, and we hope to see you in another episode of AppSec 101. Thanks.